Hello, my friend. Welcome to the study. Did you ever wonder what it would be like to be a university student in the Middle Ages? Today, let's look at some history of Western European universities. Learning new things is always good for our minds, for our spirit, for our soul, and for us to get along with each other and understand each other better. The university, that institution that justly became the pride and joy of all who cherished the traditions of learning and culture, had its beginnings from a fusion of ideals, cultures, and support systems held together by the glue of a common desire to learn, to understand, and to broaden one's views so as to be helpful to others. In many ways, university education is not much different from what we can see today, and in some ways it has changed greatly. But after almost a millennium, it remains a significant part of society. It was during the 12th century that corporations of students and teachers began forming in Europe. Universitas Magistrorum et Scholarium, at monastery and cathedral schools. The expansion of trade and commerce, as well as a concentration of prosperity and culture in Europe's cities, meant a richer civic life and more culture and opportunities for everyone. This complexity of life brought new problems that had to be faced, with solutions demanding a depth and acuteness of mental learning that could no longer be provided solely by the monastery and cathedral schools. And so, in the 12th century, arose the universities, those educational institutions of higher learning that would become the principal carriers of theoretical and practical knowledge. Students from different countries would flock to universities, and they usually remained in groups called nations. At the university in Paris, there were 4 main nations: French, Picards, Normans, and English. The English nation included, oddly, Germans, Scandinavians, Poles, Hungarians, and Bohemians, as well as English. All together, they formed the Universitas Nationum, the unity of nations, of students and professors. Among the first of the universities were Salerno, Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. France, in particular, experienced a cultural and intellectual renaissance, Paris becoming the city of philosophers and a center of learning, its university deriving stimulus from the Arabic and Jewish centers of learning in Spain. Paris, having developed its liberal arts curriculum out of the Cathedral School of Notre Dame, served as a model for universities in the north. Famous teachers from Paris include Peter Abelard, the founder of the Scholastic method of argumentation, Hugh of St. Victor, and Peter Lombard. The first university on German imperial soil was in Prague, established in 1348 by Emperor Charles IV, and it was followed by a surge of German universities, and following the general pattern of the craft guilds, with students and professors united as members of a guild society for the purpose of study, instead of apprentices, journeymen, and masters. There were students, bachelors, and professors. The method of learning was mostly rote. There were lectures and disputation, and memorization was key. Everything was oral, and everything was in Latin, so language barriers between nations were overcome by this lingua franca. A professor would dictate the text with his commentary. The all-encompassing philosophy was a cornerstone of learning. The natural world, which included what is modern sciences, was slowly emerging and had yet to develop a system. Salerno was known for medicine, Montpellier for law. Newer models were Paris, students under the control of ecclesiastical teachers. Bologna was famous as a law school, with teachers under the control of the students. Oftentimes, there were migrations from older universities to begin or establish new ones. Oxford and Palencia from Paris, Padua and Siena from Bologna. In the case of Oxford, it was a spat between feudal kings that set the migration in motion. In the 12th century, Oxford was the site of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine's Beaumont Palace, where Richard Lionheart and his brother John were born. Henry had a falling out with the French king Louis VII, Eleanor's first husband, of Second Crusade fame. Louis had supported the exiled Thomas Becket against Henry, and the dispute resulted in the nation of English students and teachers at the University of Paris to repatriate. Being expelled, or possibly also recalled, they went to Oxford, the seat of the English monarch. The royal residence signified patronage, preferment, a centre of commercial importance, and a concentration of religious houses, themselves producers and consumers of books and learning. It was inevitable that violence between these townsfolk and students would occur from time to time. The result was the formation of the university, an organization resulting from a papal charter or royal charter. In 1214, Oxford received its first church-appointed chancellor and charter. In 1215, Pope Innocent III effected the establishment of the University of Paris, confirming the autonomy of the corporation of Universitas et Studentium from local and church authorities, and by giving them this power of self-governance, students would be subject to ecclesiastical, not civil law, except in criminal cases. Classrooms would consist of great numbers of boys huddled together around a teacher on the floor or sometimes on wooden benches, in bare lodging houses, in church porches, in gardens. Soon, religious houses supported student life and masters, and later colleges. Establishments that were fully autonomous, self-governing institutions with control over their own administration and assets. A university consisted of 4 faculties: liberal arts, theology, law, and medicine, which were all quite different than what they connote today. The 7 liberal arts were arranged in 2 tiers: the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic to perfect the student's Latin and mastery of techniques of reasoning and persuasion, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, music, geometry, and astronomy. These focused mainly on the philosophical and theological implications of the subjects. Grammar, rhetoric, and logic were related to the discipline of reading and writing Latin. Arithmetic was used for accounting and administration. Music formed an integral part of church services, but also sciences. Astronomy was used to predict the weather, to navigate, and to glean information about geography. Geometry was a means of showing transcendental truths via the various laws that governed angles and lines. The study of trivium and quadrivium enjoyed prominence at the 3 great northern universities of Oxford, Cambridge, and Paris. In Italy, Spain, and the south of France, where the curriculum was more career-oriented, study centered more on law and medicine. Paris taught the new logic, Aristotle. The first degree awarded by a university was a baccalaureate, or predecessor to the modern bachelor's degree. The A.B. or Artium Baccalaureus indicated that the student had started to do advanced work. He could go on to teach, study law, or, that Queen of Sciences theology, which culminated in the doctorate degree. A master's degree was conferred after an examination in which the student proved his ability to define, discuss, and defend propositions. The doctor's degree, deriving from the Latin doco, I teach, and doctor, teacher, not to be confused with a physician, was granted to those specializing in one profession after public examination. Curriculum was not the only part of university life to benefit from interaction with other cultures and centers of learning. The structure and philosophy of the institution itself can be said to have been influenced to a certain degree by the Arabic states, and particularly at a time when there was increasing contact between Western Europe and the Near and Middle East. The colleges of the Arabic world had formed as a kind of charitable organizations that owed their existence to the generosity of benefactors, entities that relied upon and perpetuated the idea of philanthropy, whereas the university, a chartered institution, had become the product of Europe. These two entities, like the people and ideas of the Middle Ages, were to merge and integrate, and to take on the characteristics of each other. A marriage of the corporation to the charitable trust, compositing stability with flexibility that formed the foundation of the educational institutions of today. Medieval student life was not much different than some institutions today, except that books and writing materials were astronomically expensive, which meant that unless someone was very wealthy, most things were done by rote memorization, disputation and discussion. A good purse was required of the students living in these halls for heating, fuel cost, money, candles for light, and the sleeping quarters had to be furnished if you wanted warm blankets. Food and drink, of course, also had to be paid for, which meant that cooperatives made university life more affordable for students. Classroom, as it were, conditions were cold and damp, and often poorly lit. In the 13th and 14th century, the colleges were more well apportioned for the pastoral care of the students. The proximity to the royal court that many universities afforded students meant that students could not only benefit from the cultural activity surrounding the monarch, but also go on to administrative positions within the court. The intellectual life of the Middle Ages was not one that was characterized by spontaneous or, as it were, a widely spread power of literary expression. Few people were able to write. And those that could would go from place to place, college to college, writing what was required and teaching the skill to others. Within the accommodation, as without, there was a certain amount of drinking, dicing, begging and quarrelling amongst the students and between the students and townfolk. Many students lived in halls run like cooperatives with student leadership, and others were commercial enterprises or run by graduate teachers. The halls offered cheap accommodation as well as protection from the townsfolk. Violent disputes regularly flared, and after one particularly vicious incident in Oxford, students and professors fled to start Cambridge University. Let's have a look at some of the first universities. In this very well-used book, we can see a map of Europe around and up to the 15th century. There we can see the black dots symbolize universities founded before 1300. Salerno, Arezzo, Valencia, Seville, and remember these would have been in the Umayyad Caliphate as well, so influenced greatly by the collegiate system. Lisbon, Salamanca, Montpellier, 1289. Salerno, the first one, 1173. And here we have Pavia, and it gets very crowded, and Padua, 1222. Paris, 1150. Oxford, 1167. Universities formed after 1300 are in purple. Vienna, 1365. Heidelberg, 1385. Prague, 1348. The big ones. And then, of course, Orange and Valence. Angers, 1337, and the diamonds after 1400, Aberdeen, St Andrews in Glasgow, Greifswald, Rostock. So you can see the rise of the universities in the 12th century had a momentum that hasn't stopped. Let's look at France in the 13th century. This is France up to about 1270 under Capetian monarchy. Even though it's one colour, it still was not united as the France we know today. The Duchy of Gascony, as well as Aquitaine and Normandy, oftentimes belonged to the Kingdom of England. Burgundy, Brittany were also quite independent. This shows the domain of the king, the crown, and you can see Poitou, Anjou, Blois, Normandy surrounding, and Champagne as well, surrounding this Paris, Parisian Ile-de-France. This belonged to the church, ecclesiastical holdings, and much territory here changed hands frequently during the 100 Years' War. So we have very little sense of unity as we would know today. There's another example of the changing map and allegiances. You can see how when it came to Louis XIV, the Sun King, it was advantageous to bring all of the nobles to Versailles to unify France in purpose, if not in policy. What was it like to be a student in Oxford in the 13th century? Let's read about one of the more infamous incidents. Even when Oxford was thriving and prosperous, the concentration within its walls of a large number of young men, many possessed of what the Scots call a good conceit of themselves, plus a proclivity for alcohol, always contained the potential for large-scale disorder. One of the other factors separating the students and academic world from the townspeople was the fact that the students all spoke Latin, a language the townspeople could not understand and were not educated in. The imposition of price controls implicitly subsidized the student body, and was thus another permanent source of grievance among those whose main concern was simply to get a living. Blood was drawn in a town gown skirmish in 1228, and arson ensued in another in 1236. In 1238, Chancellor Grosseteste was obliged to offer his protection to students involved in an affray at Osney Abbey, where the papal legate was staying at the time. The legate had to flee, and his brother was killed. In 1244, the Jews became the focus of attack. As a result, the Chancellor's jurisdiction was enlarged to give him exclusive jurisdiction over student debts and contracts, interest rates, and the prices of quality of goods sold to scholars. He also gained the powers of a justice of the peace to fine, banish, or imprison in the royal jail in Oxford Castle. So we see already the University Chancellor is gaining more and more power over the happenings in the town involving students. Another pogrom occurred in 1268, allegedly caused by a Jewish insult to a Christian religious procession, which seems somewhat unlikely, the more so as Jews were already on the defensive, losing royal favour and subjected to increasingly arbitrary mulcts as their numbers dwindled. In 1298, another major town-gown dispute led to several deaths, townsmen having complained to the king that many who passed themselves off as Oxford clerks were in fact outlaws on the run. Given the limited extent of the collegiate structure, the rudimentary nature of the university's embryonic central administration, and the archaic profusion of halls, there is nothing inherently improbable in this. Students were also quite capable of brutal quarrels amongst themselves, usually on north versus south lines, as in 1252, 1274, and 1334. Scots naturally allied themselves with the north, while the Welsh and Irish ranked themselves with the south. As a result, it became customary to choose proctors from north and south in alternate years to assure visible impartiality in the enforcement of order. The worst ever such incident in Oxford's history is referred to as a riot, but in terms of scale and ferocity, it was more like a civil war in miniature. The year was 1355, in the immediate aftermath of the Black Death, with the town and surrounding villages still severely dislocated. Official attempts to stabilize conditions by reimposing strict wage and price controls created further tension. The trouble began on Tuesday, 10th of February, the feast of Saint Scholastica the Virgin. Scholars drinking in the Swindlestock Tavern at the corner of Queen Street and St. Aldate's, where there's a blue plaque today, exchanged snappish words and saucy language, with Jean de Croydon over the quality of the wine he served them. The disgruntled patrons then threw both the wine and the jug it came in at their host's head. Family and neighbours rallied round the outraged tavern keeper, and soon the town bell at St. Martin's was ringing a call to arms, while townsmen set about any unarmed student within reach. The Chancellor, perceiving what great danger they were in, caused the university bell at St. Mary's to be rung out, whereupon the scholars got bows and arrows and maintained the fight till dark night, at which time the fray ceased, no one scholar or townsman being killed, yet. The the long, chilly February night failed to cool passions thus roused. Overnight, the town bailiffs forewarned householders to turn out again when the town tocsin rang out. They also called in reinforcements from the surrounding countryside. On the Wednesday morning, a band of townsmen broke up a theology lecture, and 80 bowmen attacked scholars strolling around St. Giles. Both bells then rang out, summoning the respective sides to combat. Scholars managed to block some of the gates to keep out rural reinforcements until early evening, when they at last poured in at the west gate, and the defenders fled to their lodgings. As the invaders cried, "Slay, slay, havoc, havoc. Smite fast. Give good knocks." 5 student hostels were broken into, with fire and sword. Their residents killed or maimed or grievously wounded, and their contents stolen, smashed, or trampled. Once again, the violence ended only at nightfall. On Thursday morning, the scholars, completely cowed, feared to venture into the streets, and the townspeople, scenting victory, gathered in even greater numbers to continue the ransack, forcing their way into 14 locked lodgings with iron bars and other engines. Resistors were dealt with mercilessly, and their corpses scornfully cast into houses of easement, meaning outhouses and midden heaps. Others they buried in dunghills. Chaplains were a particular target, several being scalped of their tonsures. By early afternoon, the terror had run its course, all the scholars being fled diverse ways. 63 students and an unknown number of townspeople had died. Given the power and privileges of the university, royal retribution was certain and severe. Control over the town's inns and market was transferred to the university, as was the power to police the streets by night. In addition, the mayor and 62 townsmen were ordered to attend a solemn memorial service for the souls of the dead on St. Scholastica's Day the following year, and every year thereafter, to this day. They were also obliged to swear an annual oath to acknowledge the university's rights and privileges, confirmed and extended by a new charter dated 27th June, 1355. The penitential ceremony was amended in form at the Reformation and suspended during the Civil War, but not finally abolished until 1825. St. Scholastica, interestingly, is the patron saint of convulsive children. Though Oxford had perhaps the most violent and famous outbreaks, these student and municipal disagreements and fights were not uncommon in so many universities of the Middle Ages. And so that, my friend, concludes our short sojourn university. I hope you found it interesting and relaxing. And if you have any questions, please put them in the comments. Remember to be good to yourself. Be kind to others and to students.